In today's video, I have 8 simple leaf painting techniques that work so much better than masking fluid. Masking fluid is a very useful tool, but whenever I see people use it for leaf veins, it always looks awful. We'll take a look at that in a moment. In today's video, I'm going to show you 8 really simple ways that I paint leaves. We're going to do light veins, dark veins, leaves without veins, all of the leaves. Because unless your leaf is your center of attention, in other words, unless you're painting a picture of, say, a beautiful autumn leaf, then you really can keep them very simple indeed. If they're just there to show off your flowers, then these 8 basic techniques will be all you need. Here's a sample I made yesterday, and what can we say about this? What we can say is it's a bit rubbish, isn't it? So I used masking fluid and tried to reserve the underneath layer, but all sorts of things went wrong. There's bits of masking fluid that are stuck to the paper. It's torn in places because it's just a cheap practice paper, and overall the lines just don't look very realistic. There are areas where the masking fluid has applied too thickly, they're not fine enough, and they don't taper enough. Now, as I said at the beginning of the video, I do use masking fluid, but it's completely unsuitable for this sort of subject. Now, some of you are saying, but Michelle, I've just bought this masking fluid. It's got this really fine little applicator on the end. It gives me these tiny fine lines. I don't care. They all block after a few uses, and most of them just don't look realistic enough for leaves. So let's start learning 8 better ways to do this. So for the first 4, I'm going to take you through very simple leaves that I use in my own paintings. And for the second 4, we'll be learning how to make leaf veins, both light and dark, several techniques that work a lot better than this masking fluid here. So for all of our samples today, I've put on an underwash of some Daniel Smith green gold, and I've allowed it to dry, but many of these techniques can be done on white paper. For this first one though, you'll need an underwash. We're going to do what I call a two-tone leaf. And as I said, in a flower painting, you really can keep things very simple indeed. All I'm going to do is I'm going to take the same colour and I'm just going to go a little darker down one side. Now you can draw a centre line down your leaf if you need to. I'm just going to wing it, which is always good idea when painting on YouTube, and just going to take the colour up like this, and we're just going to make one side a little darker than the other. This usually works best if you just use a similar colour and just go slightly darker on one side than the other, unless you're looking for something particularly dramatic. But if you're painting flowers, you don't really want your leaves to overshadow your flowers. So our first leaf technique is a two-tone leaf like this one. For our next leaf, we're going to go much darker, and we're going to make a soft leaf with a highlight. So what I'm going to do this time is take some much darker paint across the whole leaf. And if you do this technique on white paper, you'll get something that looks a lot more contrasty, and it'll tend to look quite shiny. If you just want a soft highlight that's less shiny, then what we're going to do is take this paint across quickly and evenly. I've got 1 or 2 little splatters there, which I'll just pick up. If your paint's very wet, it will tend to splatter more. I'm going to rinse and dry my brush. What I'm going to do now is press it in and lift out my highlight. And I'll keep wiping off onto this piece of paper, because each time I do this, I'm picking up some paint. I can even rinse my brush again and dry it to pick up the maximum amount of paint. You don't want to work on this too long, otherwise you'll start to get harsher lines. That's our next leaf, a soft leaf with a highlight. I've done mine fairly central, but you could of course do it down one side or even both. For our next leaf, we're going to do a wet into wet technique, and this one is great for if you're painting perhaps an autumn leaf. And if you want any areas to remain this light underneath colour, you can just put clean water on. So let's start with a bit of clean water here. Let's grab a bit of that dark paint I was using earlier, and we'll pop some in there. Perhaps some of the original green gold as well. And the trick to this is to apply the paint evenly without too many puddles, and not to overblend. So what I'm doing now is coming in with some of this red-brown colour. Try and make sure your water levels are even. As I said, you can blend as much or as little as you want, but of course if you keep blending, you'll end up with just one colour. This is our next type of leaf, a wet into wet leaf. Let's talk next about a leaf that fades into the background. Though I didn't come up with this idea, I think I did come up with the name, and I've always called these ghost leaves. So if you've got a huge bunch of flowers and foliage and you want to give depth to it and you want some of the leaves to look further back than others, what I like to do is to cool them down and do them very flat, like a complete flat wash. And having these flat bluer leaves means that they naturally will sink back and not come forward as much as the ones like this with lots of detail on. For this, you'll take your original colour, and you could be doing this on white paper. I just mean the colour that you're painting most of the leaves in. So I'll choose the same Daniel Smith green gold. You want to make it a bit more watery than the other leaves you've painted. And then we're going to mix in some blue. So we're mixing in the blue, adding plenty of water. If it's still looking too bright, you can add more blue. You can even add a touch of pink to push it more towards a grey-green until you get cooler, paler colour. And you'll paint this across the entire leaf in a flat wash. And you'll position these leaves at the back of your painting. I'll put a picture up so you can see one of my own paintings and how I've used this technique to make some leaves look further back than others, giving depth to the painting. So our fourth leaf is a ghost leaf. We're at the halfway point in the video. Can I ask you just quickly if you could click that like button if you appreciate free content like this, leave me a comment, or best of all, free subscribe. This channel is fully CAD approved. Let's look now at a couple of ways to add dark veins to your leaves that are fine and natural looking and that don't involve spending hours letting things dry and going in with a tiny brush. The first one we're going to do is with an embossing tool. So I've got an embossing tool here. If you don't have one of these, literally any hard blunt point will do. A crochet hook, an embroidery needle, or even a ballpoint pen that doesn't have any ink in. What we're going to do for this one is take our paint across, and whilst it's still wet, we're going to press in with our embossing tool. You can do this first on dry paper. I just find that it tends to work a little better when you go into wet paint. I've got different ends on this embossing tool that will give me different amounts of width to the lines. If you do this and you find that the effect is a little bit subtle, allow it to dry and put another layer of paint on. Every time you put more paint on, the pigment is going to sink in those dark lines. Of course, don't go too dark and too thick with the paint, otherwise you'll cover them up altogether. This is our first way of doing dark veins, is with an embossing tool. Our next way of doing dark veins on leaves is to use watercolor pencils. Now, if you use a sharp pencil, you'll get a very fine line. And if you use a blunt pencil, you'll get a thicker line. So you can choose what suits your subject best. And the fun thing about this one is you don't have to stick to green. Just make sure your pencil is darker than your leaf. So we could have something like a red vein and some green. Always with any of these techniques, go from center out so that the line naturally tapers, whether you're using a pencil, an embossing tool, or a paintbrush. You want it to taper towards the end, which is why the masking fluid doesn't tend to look very natural. Our second way of getting dark veins is with watercolor pencils. Let's look now at a couple of ways of getting light veins on dark leaves. So what I'm going to do with this one is I'm going to first of all sketch with a graphite pencil and indicate where I want my veins to be. Now, taking a small paintbrush, I'm going to paint in the gaps. Now, what I tend to do here is go sort of one side of the pencil because it'll be easy to erase that pencil later on if it doesn't have a load of paint on top. And I'm just going to come into each section. You notice I'm working round methodically from one side to the other. And you might be saying, oh, Michelle, I can't paint very neatly. Honestly, even if you end up covering up some of your veins, I still think this looks more natural than using masking fluid. So we're going to come across like this. I'm also going to leave that center stem, and you'll see that more when I get to the other side. So I'm coming down the other side now. When you're painting like this, go out a little bit wider than you think you need to, because you can always then adjust it and take the paint in a little bit more. Notice how even with the brush, I'm still coming center out. Now this side down here is drying, but I'm not going to go back and fiddle with that at all because then I'd get a load of drying lines. So I'm just coming down the other side without touching those first areas. And all I need to worry about is keeping this particular edge wet as we come down and complete the leaf. Once this is dry, I'll remove the pencil. Our first way of getting light veins on dark is using a paintbrush. For our second way of getting light veins on dark, we're going to scratch out with a knife, and it's worth trying this technique out on a scrap of paper first because the way you use the knife denotes whether the lines will be light or dark. For example, if we were just to scratch side on like this, we'll get a similar result to the embossing tool. It'll just be a little bit finer. And if you want really fine lines on your leaves, then that's a great way to do them. I don't know if you can quite see that on screen. Let's put another layer on. There you can just see them starting to appear there. So there we've got dark veins, but what we actually want to do is rather than hold the knife completely on its side and make scratches, we're just going to tip it up and use about the first millimetre to scrape out the paint like that. I'll show you a little closer there. So let's have a go at this one. I'm using a nice big brush so I can get my paint on quickly because this works best on wet paper. And the paper's fragile and we're scraping out a little layer. So the lines won't be entirely smooth. They'll have a slight scruffiness to the edge of them, which I don't mind. And again, coming up from the base, always in the direction that something grows, we're going to come up like this. Now you'll get varying results. You may get light areas that have a little bit of a dark surrounding, and actually, you know, that's fine. We've got that going on in our center there. Let's see if we can come up again and remove a bit more paper. And so it's a matter of sort of pressing the edge of the knife in. If you're going to try this one, I advise practicing on a scrap of paper first. That's our second way of getting light veins on dark. They have got some dark outlines. We've definitely got some lightness there too, and that's with using a craft knife. So of course there's a lot more than 8 types of leaf that you can paint, and of course you can combine 2 or more of these techniques in one leaf, or you can use them as a jumping off point to add lots of other new techniques in. I'll link to a video at the end of this one that's going to help you. And before you leave this video, don't forget to have a look in the video description. You'll find details down there all about my Facebook group. That's completely free. You can also grab some free downloadable PDFs and find out all about my paid and free online courses. I'll put another watercolor techniques video up for you to watch right now.